have a handout or access to a handout? Got a couple more up here. We can always go get some made, some more made. The lights will flicker. Light will flicker. Everybody ready for Fred? Everybody ready for Fred?
For Fred, oh, yeah, for Fred?
All right. Fred may not be too bad. Grace is the one we need to keep an eye on. You think Grace will fizzle out?
No, and I was gonna go with
Oh, you're going to the outside? They could have it.
I think it's staying south. No.
And you're sticking with it?
And I'm sticking with it.
She's staying more south. She used to stay more south. Okay.
All right.
We'll get some.
And you know, Gary and I, he did not go to school at Alabama Christian, but his preaching, we went to a preacher school, and a lot of those teachers taught at Alabama Christian. They crossed paths, so to speak. One famous saying that comes from Alabama Christian is not R.A. Baker's, but it comes from Thomas Weaver, who was the librarian. Was Thomas Weaver a librarian when y'all were there? Don't know him? Thomas Weaver had a saying. He'd go up to a couple who were holding hands, dating, whatever you want to call it, and he'd ask them, says, "Don't hold hands. We don't allow holding hands. What's left for marriage?" And one of the students said, "The other hand." So that's a famous saying from Brother Weaver. He's dead and gone on now. So, but he was a librarian when I was there. So, he didn't say it to me, but that was the word that was handed down. Did anyone have any issues with patience this week? As Gary talked about it a couple weeks ago, we're going to talk about it today.
It was better.
It was better? You handled it better?
A little improved.
Okay. Well, I was warned about it when I announced the subject for this week. I was warned to be careful. Well, it didn't take long. Monday morning is when it hit. Susan had a colonoscopy scheduled for 10:30 Monday morning, and we were supposed to be there at 9:30 at the Fort Walton Beach Outpatient Surgery Center, whatever they call it. So we get there at 9:30. She gets checked. She'd already done the online check-in stuff. So all we had to do was make copies of her cards and ID and sign off, saying we're not going to sue them, and you know, that sort of thing. So they call her back about 10:30. Well, we think, all right, we're on schedule. This is going to be cool. At 12:20, they come and get her. So for almost 2 hours, we was in that little back room back there. Procedure only took a little over about 40 minutes before she came back. But sitting in that little room for 2 hours, and they wouldn't come in and say what was the problem. So
You had time to watch Gary's YouTube.
well, the problem was that there was a TV in the room, but we didn't turn it on. But you know how they have computers now in every room?
Yeah.
Well, if you're, Bob, I have to tell you how to do this. There's usually the nurses have to sign in with their passcode, and that tells IT who's signing in. But if you look real close, usually in the bottom, there's a guest login. You click on that guest login, and it opens up. So there's Google Chrome. I said, okay, I can go in and check my emails while I'm waiting on Susan. They have AOL blocked. So I couldn't do anything. So I just sat there.
It's okay, those things have key loggers on them.
I know it. They would have tracked me. Yeah, we used to do that at Troy. We used to block different things at Troy too. So.
AOL still in business?
Oh, yeah.
Hey, Gary, that's the only browser worse than Safari.
I don't use the browser. I
No,
just
don't
use the
worry,
email.
anyone does.
I found a new one, but anyway, I digress. So. Anyway, today we're continuing in our study of James, chapter 5. If you haven't already, turn your Bibles or electronic devices to chapter 5. And we'll be looking at verses 7 through 12. 7 through 12. And who would like to volunteer to read that for us this morning? Oh, by the way, does everybody have a handout? If you don't have a handout, there's still a few up here. So, all right, who would like to read verses 7 through 12? Okay, Marie.
patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you will be condemned.
Okay, so to get us started, what does James say the believer's attitude should be toward the coming of the Lord?
Patience.
Be patient, or wait patiently, depends on the translation. James was still addressing the suffering saints when he wrote, be patient. God is not going to right all the wrongs of this world until Jesus comes, but we believers must wait patiently or patiently endure. James reminded us of the coming of the Lord in James 5 through 9, and we must patiently endure hardships and heartaches until he returns. Patient means the capacity to accept or tolerate delay, trouble, or suffering, and here's the key, without getting angry or upset. But the question we must answer is, how can we as Christians experience patient endurance as we wait for the Lord to return? To answer that question, James gave 3 encouraging examples of patient endurance. 2 of them are in the category of do this right now, and the other one, don't even start doing it. But in verse 7, he says, be patient or patiently endure. James tells the Christian victims to be patient and avoid turning on one another, for the Lord is returning again. Their suffering one day will disappear just like the treasures of the earth, of the rich. If we are being mistreated, we are not to take vengeance ourselves. We are not responsible for others' conduct. We are to be patient with these people and the injustices in the world as we wait for the Lord's return. Using the illustration of the farmer, James tells us that this waiting period of time is temporary. An impatient person does not make a good farmer. No crop appears overnight, and no farmer has control over the weather. Too much rain can cause the crop to rot, and too much sun can burn it up. And early frost can kill the crop. Anyone farmers in here? David Bailey is. He's about the closest we have to a farmer, I think.
I have a pig.
Yeah.
One pig.
You have one pig.
One pig, yes. On 3 trays.
Did anybody grow up on a farm? Who grew up on a farm? Okay. So you know you have, for the most part, no control of what's going to happen, right? I mean, the Lord provides. He either does or he doesn't. Some years he does, some years he doesn't. So you kind of have to take it, and forgive me, with a grain of salt, right? So you cannot be an impatient person and be a farmer. James pictured the Christian as a spiritual farmer looking for a spiritual harvest. The Lord sends the sunshine and the rains of his goodness to water and nurture the seeds planted, but we must be patient and wait for the harvest. Impatient with God often leads to impatience with God's people, and this is a sin we must avoid. If we start using the sickles on each other, we will miss the harvest. Any questions or comments about the farmer and farming and being patient, being a patient farmer? Yes, sir. Jim?
What does take it with a grain of salt mean?
Can I circle around on that for next week?
Absolutely.
Okay. I gave you the creeks don't rise thing last week, right?
And I answered that for you.
Yeah. Grain of salt. All right. Check with me next week. Any other questions? pertaining to what we're talking about. There's always one in the crowd, you know, you have to be patient with them.
Wayne's not here.
I did, it's my fault. It's my fault.
Jim's sitting in for Wayne this week.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
I wouldn't say anything.
I just asked a
What,
question.
Marie?
I just, in the notes, why did you say James tells the Christian victims to be patient?
Because if you've read the whole context of the book of James, you know that they're being mistreated by rich people and government people, all of the above.
So it's okay to think of ourselves as victims when we're impatient?
No,
No,
No.
not victim, because you're impatient.
Teasing.
no. Just because you're impatient doesn't make you a victim. But when you're a victim, you need to be patient sometimes. Did that answer your question? Okay.
He does talk about, this is sort of a time frame. You know, he talks about the spring and the autumn rains.
Yeah.
So he's trying to give them, I mean, they feel like they have been patient, waiting on the Messiah to deliver them from the Romans.
Yeah,
So, and that's been hundreds of years, so they're ready, you know, to be, for something to happen tomorrow.
Yeah.
He said, you know, even your farmers wait,
right,
you know, during the year.
yeah. They plant, they cultivate, plant, and then they wait. And then when harvest comes, then they harvest, and then they start the cycle all over.
Think about waiting on the deliverance from the Egyptians.
Yeah. Was that 400 years? The second example of patient endurance is establish your hearts. In the first part of verse 8, New King James uses the term establish your hearts. NIV uses stand firm. I like to establish your hearts better, so that's what I use. When we turn to His Word, we strengthen our hearts. True treasure is stored up in heaven. True blessing comes from God, and true happiness comes from our relationship to Him. Jesus' second coming is near. The word often used in theology is imminent, which means that it could happen at any time. We do not know the day or the hour, so we need to be ready all the time. Any questions or comments about our hearts, establishing our hearts, or standing firm? Anybody else have a different terminology in the translation? Final example of patient endurance is do not grumble, verse 9. All these injustices done to believers by the rich might lead us to complain and grumble. James warns against this using twofold logic. The judge is standing at the door, and he will hold these people accountable for their sins, and he will also judge us if we respond in the wrong way. Who's the judge? God. So the example for us is in verse 10. He uses the example of the prophets. What character traits does James say the Old Testament prophets demonstrated to us? Verses 10 and 11.
Patience and suffering.
Patience and what?
Suffering.
Patience and perseverance in suffering. So if we're going to have suffering, we need to have patience and perseverance. The prophets were in the will of God, yet they suffered. Many of the prophets had to endure great trials and sufferings, but the Lord delivered them. Even some died for their faith. Those who speak in the name of the Lord often must endure difficult trials so that their lives might back up their messages. We need to remind ourselves that our patience in times of suffering is a testimony to others around us. This example that James used from the Old Testament prophets ought to encourage us to spend more time in the Bible, getting acquainted with these heroes of faith. The better we know the Bible, the more God can encourage us in the difficult experiences of life. Any other comments about the prophets?
I think it's significant he brings them up because these were godly people doing God's will, and they were suffering because the thinking, especially Old Testament thinking, and so much was like, oh, well, you must have brought this on yourself.
Yeah.
You know, and certainly if we feel that way, I would think that would encourage them to, and encourage us to today to think, this doesn't mean I've blown it.
Yeah.
This isn't that God is with me.
It goes
You
to
can feel
the-
like He's not with you when you're going.
It goes to the question, why do bad things happen to good
Yeah.
people and vice versa? This is an example right here of that. Prophets are probably, as far as human people at that time, they were top of the list as far as faithful. So yet, like Marie's saying, they suffered persecution and heartache and trouble and
Swallowed in the belly of the fish.
yeah, and yeah, all of the above. So, anything else? So, since you talked about some of the prophets, verse 11, who is specifically named and what lesson should we learn from him? Two-part question. First of all, who is named? Job. And what lesson should we learn? Patience. Is that what you said? Okay. Do what?
Perseverance even in severe.
Yeah, perseverance is what we were looking for. Yeah, that's okay. Patience is fine. In 25 words or less, would someone like to give us the story of Job? Does everybody know the story of Job? Do we?
He had a lot, he lost a lot, but he persevered.
There you go. That's about 10 words. That'll work.
Naked came I into this world, naked shall I go. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
So God, Satan goes to God and says, hey, this guy Job is a believer of you, but that's because you've kind of encircled him in protection. Give me a chance to get to him. God says, okay, but you can only go to a certain point, no further. So Job takes his house, his kids, and his livestock, right? And then later his health. And I think it's
And the good advice of his wife takes that too.
well, we don't count that. But yeah, he lost basically everything except his wife. And like Deborah says, well, we'll go there. He probably needed a new wife too, but that's beside the point. Yeah. But anyway, Job keeps his faith, and God blesses him. And how much did God bless him with? Huh? Was it tenfold? Well, I'm asking. Was it tenfold? What was it, Robert? You gave twice as much is what we're saying. Yeah. That is in Job 42:17. It says twice. So, Bernard?
No, I had the two.
I thought you had a question. I'm sorry. Yeah. 42:17 says it was twice.
No, it doesn't.
Look at it.
I'm looking at it.
What does it say?
And so Job died an old man and full of years.
I get 7.
Yeah, there you go.
I get 7. It's in there.
No, that's just the epilogue from the Lord said to Job about his
Lynn, your
friends.
patience is being tested right now, isn't it?
It's okay. I looked this up.
Verse 10, after Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before.
There we go. 10. All right, 42:10 is where it says twice.
Yeah.
So,
My memory
fact check.
hasn't failed.
Yep. Do what, Bernard?
My memory hasn't failed yet.
No, you're right. There is something about tenfold. Where does that come from? Is that somebody else?
Teresa?
All right, so let's look at Job, verses 11 and 12. Because Jesus' coming is near, we should also endure. The good news is that no matter what difficulty we are in the middle of, God loves us, He is compassionate and merciful, and has good plans for us. There may be no victories without battles, no peaks without valleys. If you want the blessing, you must be prepared to carry the burden and fight the battle. We must remember that blessings come after we have endured. And this was the example of Job. In the first 3 chapters of the book of Job, you have Job's distress, where he loses his wealth and his family, except for his wife, and then later his health. In Job 4 through 31, we read of Job's defense, where he debates his 3 friends. And then 38 through 42 is where Job's deliverance. God first humbles Job, and then he honors Job and gives him twice as much as he had. It is difficult to find a greater example of suffering than Job. Satan predicted that Job would get impatient with God and abandon his faith, but that did not happen. Job questioned God's will, but he did not forsake his faith in the Lord. To believers, Job's story means that God permits Satan to try his children, but he always limits the extent of the enemy's power. When you find yourself in the fire, remember that God keeps his gracious hand on the thermostat. Satan wants us to get impatient with God, for an impatient Christian is a powerful weapon in the devil's hands.
I think Daniel's example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is really better sometimes than Job, because the answer to their prayer was, even if God does not save us, we believe and worship God.
Yeah.
And Job never lost his life.
Yeah, and their
they were
life,
willing to,
they were willing,
to
yeah.
give their lives,
Yeah.
and that was the answer to their prayer as far as they were concerned.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we need to understand that God's answer to our prayer might not be what we think it ought
Yeah.
to be.
Yes, sir.
But Job was a unique man in many ways. But first of all, in the day and time in which he lived, he was fabulously wealthy.
He was. Yeah.
Okay, and there's a saying that goes, if you want to hurt a rich person, make him poor.
Right.
Okay.
Hit the pocketbook.
Right.
Yeah.
And in Job's case, in making him poor, he never lost his faith in
Right.
God. Okay. He never sinned.
Right.
Okay. He never committed any transgressions against
He
God.
questioned God at one point, but he never lost that faith, right?
Correct.
So,
Correct. Okay. And I believe that the trials and tribulations that Job went through, based on the circumstances from whence he came, made his patience more outstanding than any of the character in the Bible, because of everything that he had amassed initially, and then he lost all of it, but he never lost his faith.
right,
And then God rewarded him for that by giving him twice as much as what he had originally had.
right. Yep. We use Job in class today because that's who James used, right?
Yeah.
We could use others, so, but we're using Job
Like
because that's
Joseph.
who James does. Someone else have a hand up?
I'm always just overwhelmed by he lost all his children.
Yeah.
And
At
That
one time,
definitely-
apparently at one time.
yeah, and to me, that would be the thing more than anything else that would make a parent
Yeah,
question God
yeah,
and the hardest loss.
yeah,
I mean, they're all hard, all of it, but
yeah. I've never gone through that, but I can only imagine, yeah. Kevin?
Yeah, so I was thinking, obviously the example of you losing your life is huge with respect to challenging your faith in God. But after you think about what Job's been through, I mean, it's already been mentioned, all the losses he had, children, and then even his own health. I think some people can get to the point where they almost wish for death.
Yeah,
In fact, his wife encouraged him
yeah.
to just curse God.
Yeah, that's what his wife said, wasn't it? Hey, just die.
And that's a way of escape.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a way of escape from
yeah,
it. But he did not even entertain that.
yeah,
Instead endured. So.
yeah.
Why,
That escape is the opposite of the perseverance.
Yeah, exactly.
Why
Yeah.
would God let Satan do anything? I mean, he let Satan do this. Why?
You have to ask him when you get there, but,
he bargains with him, like,
yeah, there's give and take to some degree, but, yeah.
There is more between God and Satan than we can understand, I think. That's what I believe. And I think we're gonna understand at some point,
By and by.
by and by, but that's one of those things that I don't think that we can quite comprehend right now. That's a very good question, though. It's one to be answered.
But Satan has a lot of power right now on earth, right? God has given Satan power on earth up to a line. And God's not gonna let Satan cross that line, wherever that line is. I mean, I don't know it. We can't comprehend it probably. Jim,
Can I get one more?
go for it.
I can't remember the exact scripture, but God cannot be in the presence of sin. So how can he deal with the devil?
I don't know.
Who says he's in the presence?
Said God, that Satan came among them.
Yeah,
Good point.
I don't know.
One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them.
Yeah.
So I've changed my feeling on that because of Job, is because obviously God doesn't tolerate sin, but I don't say that he's never in the presence of sin again.
Well, I'm pretty sure there's a scripture that directly states that he cannot tolerate sin in his presence.
Okay, Jim, we're gonna assign you that for homework.
There you go.
That's your homework for next week.
Google that. Let me see what Google says.
Bernard?
I think what Job, this is from Bernard 1:1.
Yeah.
You're gonna read it now, you're gonna hear it first thing. I think that was for our experience, because again, the Old Testament was written for our learning.
Right.
I think God was trying to show us today, if you trust in him, he's going to take you through whatever situation you're going through or you may go through.
Yeah.
So by having that experience, we can read what happened to Job.
Yeah.
We can rely on having, if we have faith in God and trust him, he's going to bring you through, even if it's death, or you're going to get prosper more like Job did.
Yeah.
So it's for us. It's not for anyone else, not for any other understanding. It's for us today.
Yeah, that's the bottom line. That's the bottom line of the story. Todd?
So just to help Jim out, there once was a really, really wise preacher that preached on Habakkuk for a long time.
That's good.
Yeah, I'm done. But Habakkuk, in his discussion back and forth with God, said, "Your eyes cannot look upon evil."
Yeah.
And I think that may be the verse.
That's where he's
thinking
coming from,
of.
yeah.
And that was really Habakkuk's opinion of, why are you letting these evil people do all this stuff? Not that you couldn't be in the presence of it, but you shouldn't be letting this happen.
Yeah.
They're bad people, they're doing bad stuff,
Yeah.
they're letting it happen. That's my interpretation, that not that God doesn't see it and aware of it and around it, but there may be enough.
We know he sees it.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that. We pretty well close the door on that. You think it's a backup, you gonna take the backup, or you gonna work on that?
I'm gonna work on it.
Okay. Any other comments, questions? Yes, sir.
I think I have the verses.
Have you found it?
Psalm 5:4, and then I have a few different versions of them.
Okay.
The ASV says, "For thou art not a God that hath pleasure in wickedness, evil shall not sojourn with thee." But I think that means, there's another better one, sorry. It says, "For you are not a God with delights in wickedness, evil cannot dwell with you." Or, yeah, it says dwell in a lot of them.
Okay. That's Psalm 5:4?
They cannot stay in your presence, yes.
Okay.
Psalm 5:4.
Okay. Well, thank
So
you.
maybe they cannot stay in his presence, but maybe he could be there, they could be there, but for a select amount of time, possibly. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Well, we know that no sinner will dwell in heaven.
Right, no.
Well, Satan did.
Not dwell in heaven with God. Oh,
We don't know how-
He was
did
thrown
before-
out of heaven.
Yeah.
Before he was a sinner, he did, yeah.
But we don't know how long that was.
No.
All right, continuing on. We left off where Satan wants us to get impatient with God, for an impatient Christian is a powerful weapon in the devil's hand. Moses' impatience robbed him of a trip to the Holy Land. Abraham's impatience led to the birth of Ishmael, and Peter's impatience almost made him a murderer. When Satan attacks us, it is easy for us to get impatient and run ahead of God. Remind yourself that the Lord has a gracious purpose in all of this suffering, and that He will work out His purposes in His time and for His glory. John Bevere has this statement: if the devil could destroy us whenever he wanted to, he would have wiped us out a long time ago. Who had read that statement before?
I would say me, but I don't have that
Okay.
good memory.
You're probably correct.
Anyone in the Tuesday night.
Anybody in the
class
Tuesday night class, this is where this comes from. So,
who's read the book by John Bevere.
yeah. Chapter 3, first part of chapter 3.
Looking at you, Jim.
So we talked a lot about Job. Anybody have any other comments or questions about Job? In verse 12, in discussing the coming judgment of the Lord, James reminds us that all of our speech will be judged by God. Therefore, we must be careful not to swear. The New Living Translation says, never take an oath. So what does it mean to swear? Who can define the word swear for us?
Take God's name in vain?
Is that swearing?
In modern verbiage, that's what we think that is.
That is not correct.
That is not what the Bible
That is not the true definition.
Swears to affirm that something is, that what you are saying or testifying to is true.
That's correct. The dictionary definition: make a solemn statement or promise, undertaking to do something or affirming that something is the case. Some similar words: promise, vow, take an oath, guarantee. Now, the second definition, Pat, is use offensive language, especially as an expression of anger. So that's where that comes from. In the King James Version, there are 57 verses and 22 books that talk about swearing. So what is an oath? What's the difference? And what's an oath?
Would that be almost like people sort of try to say and put their curse on you or something, like a promise or something? What is
Curse? Being an oath? I don't think so. Yes, ma'am.
When you're in the courtroom as a witness.
Yeah, you say an oath in the courtroom. But what are you doing? I mean, what is an oath?
Swearing.
You're declaring
You swear. According to Barnes' notes, a solemn affirmation or declaration made with an appeal to God for the truth of what is affirmed, and invoke His vengeance and renounce in His favor if what is affirmed is false. That is an oath, according to Barnes. I'm just a messenger, Pat.
Okay.
James has taught throughout the book that our speech is a test of our true character. As such, we should know that God is always listening and will hold us accountable for every word we speak. Scholars are divided over whether this passage teaches all oaths are wrong. Most scholars believe some oaths are permissible. In Numbers 30, verses 1 and 2, Moses instructed the heads of the tribes of Israel how to make a vow or take an oath. Leviticus 6, 1 through 5 tells that the punishment is for swearing falsely. And God actually participated in an oath in Hebrews 6, 13 through 15. Huh? Yeah. But here James is teaching Christians to have integrity. The Jews had a system set up where one kind of oath didn't have to be kept and another did. For example, they might swear by the food on the altar, by the stones of the temple, but as long as they refrain from swearing by the name of Jehovah, these oaths may not be binding. To the uninformed or foreigner, they would naturally believe the oath and act accordingly, but later it would be broken, and the one who gave it could just say, didn't count, never mind. This was a type of oath similar to our habit of crossing our fingers. Contracts are even more complicated. The dishonest use long and complicated contracts to trick people and leave loopholes for breaking their word. Written in a lot of legalese, as we would say. We don't need to have different levels of promises. Our yes should be yes and our no should be no. Anytime we say we will do something, we should do it, even if it hurts, and even if no one else is forcing you to keep it. So my question is, if you make an agreement but later find out it is unfavorable to you, what should you do? You've given your word or made an agreement, but then you later find out it's not to your advantage. What do you do?
Follow through with it.
Honor your word, follow through with it.
Unless you can renegotiate and the party will forgive you of it.
Clear communication.
All right.
First rule.
Okay. First thing you do, if none of that's true, is you follow through with it, whatever the cost. Right?
The
Now,
expectation, Lynn, is that the legal system we work under is legal.
well, I'm not getting, this is
A lot
not
of
a
scholars that say what we're agreeing to is really not a legal document.
Yeah, this is not, I'm not making a political statement, I'm making a moral statement. Yeah, our tendency is to find the loophole and get out of it, but, Jim?
I've always remembered the statement about the difference between experience and knowledge.
Uh-huh.
Knowledge is what you get when you read every line of a contract.
Yep.
Experience is what happens when you don't.
You don't, yep. And that education can be expensive, right?
Yes.
So when you're reading through, dealing with Jesus' recommendations for dealing with conflict, in other words, a contract, the first thing he says to do is go to that brother.
Yeah.
And go to that person. And most of you probably don't know who Donald Miller is. He works with businesses on clear communication. His whole deal is clear communication. It's based on that verse.
Yeah.
And everything he does when he's consulting for business, the very first thing you do is communicate clearly.
Yeah.
And if that's any kind of conflict, and that's according to Jesus' words, that's rule number one. As soon as you start going and secretly doing this and this, well, there's only one place that divisiveness and secrets and everything comes from. There's only one place that comes from.
Satan.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not of God. And
Right.
so, as Christians especially, clear communication is top.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong, like Deborah said, there's nothing wrong with going to the person and trying to renegotiate. But if they won't,
Then you keep your
you
word.
gotta keep your word. So, yep. So we need to be careful before we make promises. Think before you speak, and remember to consider God's will before making a promise. We learn in James 4:15, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this and that. So what are Christians to do in response to our opposition in 7 through 12? Be patient until the coming of the Lord. Establish our hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Don't grumble against one another, for the judge is standing at the door. And do not swear or make rash oaths, but let our yes be yes and our no be no. To sum it up, if you've sown the right seed, you will eventually reap a harvest of blessing, so be patient. If you've been exploited, be patient. The judge is at the door. And if you've been going through trials, be patient. God is still on the throne. Any other questions or comments? Got a few minutes. So the question, or the statement, or question, I forgot exactly where it was, came up about taking an oath in court. When and for what reason was the word affirm allowed to be substituted for the word swear when taking an oath? Because now when you go to court, you say, what do they say?
You
Swear or affirm. They cover both bases. At what point was the word affirm inserted into that statement?
When I was a kid.
When you was a kid.
Yeah, because I remember.
Be careful.
Yeah.
Don't say when I was a kid.
It was before that? Wow.
Yeah.
Really?
Well, they
Yeah.
taught about it then.
Be careful. You fix to find out how old you are, Deborah.
Well, I'm old. I'm very old.
Does anybody know with before they Google it?
November 3rd, 1917.
That was before I was a kid, just for the record.
At the time of the Constitution, several states allowed Quakers to escape taking an oath as a condition of assuming elected office. In the 1780 Constitution of the state of Massachusetts provided that any person of the denomination called Quakers shall make this affirmation omitting the word swear and inserting instead the word affirm, and omitting the words so help me God, and subjoining instead the words this I do under the pains and penalties of perjury. So you were born in 1780? So it goes back basically to the original Constitution. And let's say this, we sometimes.
What did Dixon say?
Who?
Dixon, he was sworn in, what did he say? He was a Quaker.
I don't remember.
That was when I was a kid.
Remember. Some people don't know what that means, do they?
I'm not a crook.
So sometimes Quakers get a bad rap for their beliefs, but we have to give them the forthwith to know that they stood up for this and demanded that be inserted.
I don't know that when you testify in court, affirm was, when I was a child, that was not a part of it. Do you so solemnly swear?
Yeah.
And we were taught to say, I do so affirm.
Right, yeah,
So
you're right.
swear or affirm was not in there.
I do remember that now, you are correct. Yeah, and even.
Not that old.
That old, because I remember being taught that you can't swear, you can't say yes. You
Yeah,
have to
I
say,
do
I
remember
do so
that.
affirm.
And now even printed statements that you sign, it's like that. All right, next week we're going to talk about prayer, and we'll finish out chapter 5. So, everyone have a safe week. Get ready for Fred. Button down the hatches of your boats and make sure they're tied up.
And grace.
Are you still stuck on the lift? Can you get it off the lift now?
No, it's working. But I don't have a trailer, so we're gonna put it up as high as we can.
Take it out into the bay and anchor it down.
Yeah,